Greetings, everyone. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I welcome you today to our first Let's Chat About Inclusive Education session that we're going to hold with an interesting individual working in the inclusive education field here in Canada. My guest hosts are Diane Richler from Toronto, who would have been introduced to you in our initial video that we published previously, and Jackie Speck from London, Ontario. Diane is a chairperson of the Catalyst on Inclusive Education, which is part of Inclusion International, and Jackie is at the University of Western University in London, Ontario. Our guest today is Leslie Trudel, who's the associate dean and assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. And Leslie's had a long career in public education, more recently moving to the university level, and has been intently involved in inclusive education at the school, the district, the provincial, and now at the university level. And we welcome her to our little coffee clatch today. And so we're going to open up and chat with Leslie about her perspectives on inclusive education. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, Gordon. Really appreciate being here and humbled that you asked me to do this as one of your first chats.
So the first question, of course, is how did you get involved in inclusive education? Why is it an issue for you? What have you been, how have you engaged with it over the last number of years? Can you share that with us?
For sure. I started out as a teacher. I was interested in teaching because there was a family tradition of teachers. So my grandmother was a principal of the Knoll School for Boys in Winnipeg. This is going back to the 1920s. And so there was some pressure in my family to look at education as a career. And when I did get into education, it was right out of high school. So I started teaching at 22. So I took a 4-year Bachelor of Education program. And I found a job outside in the rural area, outside of Winnipeg, in the rural area of Manitoba, because at the time there weren't a lot of jobs in the city. And in the rural area, there were, I wouldn't say high classroom sizes, but the classroom sizes were fairly robust and the students had high needs and there weren't a lot of supports. And I quit teaching. I left teaching promptly after a year. So in June of 1989, I left my first teaching job because I felt that I had failed as a teacher. I didn't want to teach anymore. I felt I couldn't meet the needs of the students, given the resources that I had to work with, and given the level of needs that were in the classrooms, and given the preparation that I had as a teacher through the university program. And I applied to the Faculty of Social Work I was going to become a social worker, and that was my plan. So I felt if I couldn't meet the needs of students and youth in one way, I might be able to meet them in another way. And I have to tell you that that never turned out. Of course, you know, the end of the story was that I ended up in the system for public education for 30 years. But I largely went back into education. It was a favor to my mother, who couldn't understand why I would have spent 4 years learning about something and then just walked away from it. But I have to tell you that when I got back in, then I needed to commit to learning more about how to support students. And so that was really my initiation into inclusive education and this whole field. Yeah, so that's the long answer.
Were the students that you had to learn more about serving effectively, were they kids that we would call intellectually delayed, or with intellectual disabilities? Are they with reading problems and social problems, or a mixture of all of them?
My gosh, it was all of the above. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say less so the students with intellectual challenges. And I mean, there were certainly some of the students who exhibited, that, but it was more so the students that had behavioral challenges in the classroom, and largely because they didn't connect to the curriculum, they didn't feel it was relevant, and I wasn't sure how I would be able to make it more relevant for them, but because it wasn't relevant for them, they had gaps in their learning. So lots of non-attenders, and certainly just students who created some interesting challenges for me as a classroom teacher.
So did the schools or the school divisions that you worked in have special classes for kids with intellectual disabilities? How did that work for them in that period?
So in the rural area in Manitoba, they didn't have special classes because there weren't enough students to facilitate them. But I would imagine had there been, there probably would have been classes like that.
So
Um,
those kids were included in regular classes, whereas if they'd been in the city, they might have been in a special class.
Correct. However, having said that, if there was a resource teacher in the school, and in my school there was a resource teacher, students would be pulled out of a lot of courses. So maybe not so much the ELA, English language arts, or the math, but they would have been pulled out of their French option, right? So they wouldn't be taking French, and so they weren't served with all of their subject areas because they would have spent time outside of the classroom with a resource teacher, specifically boosting skills.
So when did you really get involved in what we now call inclusive education in a sort of systematic way?
Well, I was interested during this time, and I started taking some courses through the Brandon University. They were looking for more and more teachers who might be interested in developing capacity in this area. So one of my colleagues convinced me to enroll in a course. It was a field-based course in educators in the law, and it was through a master's program, but it was to delve into more inclusive approaches. And so I ended up getting involved in the master's degree program quite reluctantly at first. And during that time, because folks in the division knew that I was doing my master's degree, they also asked if I might be interested in a leadership position, and I entered into the world of administration. So I was a quarter-time vice principal to begin with, and I also was doing my coursework in the background in inclusive education, mostly from an administrative perspective. And I think I really got involved in it more as an administrator because I realized there needed to be grassroots work in the classroom. But I also felt that there needed to be work done at the administrative level. And those two factors had to meld together, they had to match, and you couldn't have one without the other. So if there wasn't development of organizations and systems perspectives so that we could create frameworks and that teachers could lock into some of those frameworks to work with students, then we weren't going to be able to have a successful future in this area. So I think I found a fit where my skill set seemed to work, and I felt that I was going to do the work in the area of administration.
But it's interesting, Leslie, you talk about your first year of teaching and how you gave up because you felt like you failed those kids. And I think
Yeah.
that we still hear that, right? We still hear that now, 30 years later. So
Mhm.
I'm wondering, in your years of education and now at a faculty of education, what can we do to break that cycle? How do
Mhm.
we help people feel competent and feel that they can do this in order to help inclusive education work, and in order to help teachers see that they're there for all their kids? And
Mhm.
here's how we do that.
I think from my school division experience, we developed a fairly robust program in mentorship. And when students joined, or when student teachers, teachers out of the faculty joined us as classroom teachers, we wanted to connect with them right away and make sure that they had a mentor a contact. So if they were having some challenges, they knew who to call. We had a consultant who worked with them specifically. And so each person had a match, and we spoke with them regularly throughout the year. So that was integral. And that's something that I didn't have. When I started teaching, the principal used to come into my classroom. I even saw the superintendent a lot the first year. He used to come and sit in the back of my classroom, which doesn't happen much anymore. That would be very intimidating, and it was intimidating for me. But finding people that are at the systems level, but not necessarily in an administrative position to do that mentorship. The other thing that I found interesting in my move over to the university is that because a lot of the students have gone through the system and have now experienced inclusive education, they seem to understand it. So you're not having to have the discussion with them about why this is important. They already know why it's important because they're living proof of why it's important, and they understand that. But rather you're talking about, so how do you develop the capacity to do this well? So it's much more a conversation about providing strategies and approaches. Mentorship is still critical, and that has to happen in their practicum experiences. So finding good teachers that can be with them, cooperating teachers that can work with them in the classrooms, having your professors link in the experiences that they're having in their classroom. So when I'm teaching my inclusive approaches course, I'm always talking about, so what happened in your practicum last week, and how can that connect with what we're talking about today? And I do spend time every day going over the news. So we look at what the current events are that are happening in and around our community, and how does that relate to what we're actually doing. So there's always that relevance and that feedback loop that's happening that connects them between life and the theory that we're teaching in the faculty.
Mhm. Interesting.
First of all, it's so inspiring on the one hand, just hearing your enthusiasm at wanting to become a teacher. And I think that it would be really great for more families to hear about the passion that teachers have, because unfortunately, I think so much of what we see in the news is debates between unions and government. And we don't really get to see a lot about the passion and the commitment of teachers. So it's just great to hear you talking about that. I want to switch gears a little bit because I was looking at the little bit of information that I had on your background, and I noticed that the reference to your PhD is in inclusive special education. And I hear so much about the dichotomy between inclusion and special education, and the controversy about the role of people with special education backgrounds. What did that mean to have, or what does it mean to have a doctorate in inclusive special education?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the implications?
For sure. In Manitoba, over the last number of years, there's been an ongoing dialogue about exactly what you talked about, Diane, and that is, are we moving towards inclusion, and is that a positive change or a positive shift or evolution, or um, is special education something that we need to keep hold of? Do we need to sanction it? Is there a place for it? So are we moving from, on two ends of a continuum, from special education to inclusion, or are we continuing to move forward with students who require very special provisions for them? And we also are going to move forward with students that require inclusion and would benefit from being in the classroom and have more of that universal design approach. So I think the name of the degree was there because there was that ongoing dialogue that was happening. So I don't think there was any decisiveness into it. And I have to tell you that we have a group of inclusive education professors I think we call it the Inclusive Education Professors Roundtable. So all of the professors in the universities around Manitoba, we gather on a quarterly basis, and that conversation has come up again. And I'm not sure that there's agreement on whether we want to have a specific term such as inclusion to represent the work that's going to move forward, or whether there's going to be a need to have some provisions for those that require more specialized approaches. So I don't know if that's an answer for you or a non-answer.
But what did it mean for you
for me,
in practice? Sort of, is it the same people who are responsible for providing special supports and also making sure that kids are included, or are they two different streams within the structure of a school or a school system?
you know, that's a really, really tough question, Diane, because I don't think that I wrestled that down when I was in the school system, and I'm not sure that I've arrived at an opinion on that yet as a professor. I would probably say that when I was in the school system, because I was working at the systems level and taking more of a systems approach, I would have been looking at it from more of an inclusive education practice. And because I worked in rural Manitoba, so rural education, it was really tough to find people with specialized credentials. Now, we of course ran a full services clinical department, clinician education department in our school division, but certainly we were looking to determine how we could provide more universally designed experiences in the classroom for students. So I would say we leaned more towards the inclusive education approach. Mm-hmm.
Can you share anything about, let's say, a particular principal that you work with when you work in your district that you were able to help move forward with the mindset to inclusion? Anything resonate with you on that?
For sure. I mean, a lot of our principals that were in those positions were there because they had a student services background. That was actually a common, I think, journey when you were talking about the principalship. So I saw two distinct journeys. You had those that were in the role of phys ed teacher, and you had those that were in the role of the special educator or the inclusive educator. So both seem to determine that path to the principalship. So I found that many of the folks that I worked with already did similar work and had a similar path to that I had, but and I didn't require a lot of coaching with them because they were already there. Um, Having said that, there were some others that required that coaching, right? And conversations. And I found that as we worked through some of the challenges together, it was a matter of reminding our principals about the students that they were working with and really focusing on the persons, the people that we were talking about, and how powerful it was when a principal would meet a student and work through a particular challenge that we were having and really discover the family and discover the hopes and the dreams that the parents had for the youth, and moved through some of the challenges that we were working with. And it wasn't about um, something that was theoretical, but it was largely a practical experience, and they did recognize the people that were involved, and of course they embraced that. And I had very successful experiences with the principals that I worked with. I can't recall one experience where I had a principal that wouldn't recognize the humanity in the situation. Yeah.
What about parents?
That's interesting because
Go ahead, Jackie.
Yeah.
Difficult parents. One of the things we encounter on discussions about inclusive education, at least I did when I was working in the district, is that there are parents who are simply unreasonable. They want things that aren't feasible for their child. What's been your experience with parents? Have you found them sometimes pushing the limits of what people in the school think they could do? Or have you found them to be quite collaborative and reasonable in their expectations?
Well, as a parent myself, and I have two 20-somethings, so I certainly understand the whole perspective of the parent. And when I advocate for my children, uh, I advocated really hard for them, right? And I understood the need for parents to do what they did. And so I always tried as an educator to wear different hats. So I would wear my teacher hat, I would wear my parent hat, I would wear my school administration hat, whatever that was at the time. And I always looked for commonality in the conversations. And I think we need to do more about that. I mean, certainly over the years, as we were gaining traction in the province in the legislation. So, around the early 2000s, we were getting into the appropriate education programming amendments of the Public Schools Act. There were actually provisions in legislation that then required school divisions to do specific things for parents, and parents had avenues for dispute resolution if they wanted to pursue it. So I think during those years, it was a matter of collaborating and realizing that we all have positive intent. I think it was about assuming the strengths of students before the challenges and always looking at the commonality. So there was always a commonality between what schools wanted, and there was a commonality between what parents wanted. And when parents would call me, and when I was in the role of assistant superintendent, I would get a lot of calls from parents, and I would always tell them that really I wasn't the one that held the resources. The school had all the resources. So the idea was to always work back to the school, right? So they may not want to talk to anyone at the school at that particular time, but it was important to listen and to hear and to understand what the challenges were and then to find out those commonalities. And I would do the same thing on the school end and find out what their needs and wants were. And then you try to marry the two together with some type of workable plan, and then you stay involved in it, and you have good people on your teams, right? We had a wonderful student services team. We had great resource teachers. We talked about working together in collaboration and understanding the norms of collaboration and the importance of everyone having a voice on the team. So when you have those people on your team working together with you, when you need to move back into your role, I would shift back into my role as an assistant superintendent. I knew that in schools, the principals and the school teams would be navigating appropriately because that's what we talked about. That was what we did.
Jackie?
Yeah, so I was just thinking, you've got such an amazing background in education, in the practice of it, and now you've come into the Faculty of Education. And so, what's your area of research, and how are you sort of using all of that background to inform maybe that research that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, when I first came to the university, which was in January of 2019, you can imagine coming into a university mid-year. So our dean was just going out on leave, and there were a number of people in the faculty who were out on leave as well. So I made my own way for the first half year. I was teaching a course, and I did pick up some initial areas of research and collaboration because Manitoba is going through its first review of education in 50 years. So it's a K to 12 government review. And I worked with an organization that I had actually been part of. That's how I know Gordon, is because he did some work with the Student Services Administrators Association of Manitoba, which is the group that oversees all of the administration that look after the leadership in inclusive education in the province. And so I was asked by them, because I had been a member, I had been a leader in that organization, whether I could work with them to put forward the vision for inclusive education and inclusive special education in the province over the next number of years. And so I did pull together a fairly extensive research report for them. And I also did some research with the same grouping. around the shift from categorical funding to formula-based funding, which was a switch that we had undertaken in the province in and around 2015. And there was some question as to whether that was a successful change and whether parents were experiencing some problems because of that shift in funding, or whether it was really not an issue and we just needed to move forward and continue to plan in that manner. So those were the two areas that I looked at when I first got there. My next area that I was planning on moving into was looking at the issue of school suspensions and how they are being used, especially with students that have behavioral challenges, and looking if we can't supplement that practice with other supports and resources. And so I was hoping to do a research study on that. And then COVID happened. So my current research actually has completely switched gears. It's in the area of teacher well-being, which I have to tell you, I was fairly connected to when I was in the student services role in the school division. So I was connected to mental health and well-being and all of our suicide prevention strategies in the school division and the programming for mental health and well-being. So it isn't a stretch for me really, but I have to tell you, it wasn't what I planned, but I did get involved with a research team, and we have just been swept away by a study that we did with 2,200 Canadian teachers. So this is along with Dr. Laura Sokol at the University of Winnipeg and Jeff Babb, who is in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. And we've been working with this Canadian data, and we also have a Manitoba data set looking at that. And I think what is heartwarming for me is just the knowledge that um, teachers, even though they have been very stressed by the COVID pandemic, there are a large number of teachers who are actually coping well. And we do know that there are also a large number of teachers who, even though they're coping well, are on a tipping point to maybe not doing so well. And the idea that that classroom practice is so critical to children, to all children, right? But especially to kids that have needs. And so the well-being of teachers, I'm starting to loop around to make that connection of the well-being of teachers to the efficacy and the delivery of inclusive practice. And so I think that's where I'm going to go with this afterward. And I have a PD day coming up with the student services administrators, and I'm hoping to loop them in with a questionnaire and include some of their thoughts and perspectives into that research so that I can move it back and swing back into the inclusive education lane.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting because that comes right back to the where we began this conversation with you, which is you yourself quit as a teacher because you didn't feel that you could do something. So your well-being was at risk, and we know, right?
Absolutely.
It's important to have good mental health as a teacher. So yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Leslie.
Yeah, thanks for making that connection. I never even thought of that. Thanks.
Diane?
Switching gears again. First of all, I find it fascinating that when I listen to you, what I hear are good values. I mean, what I hear is your belief in teachers, in parents, in people, and not so much the technical aspects of teaching and of supporting the system, but really instilling a culture of support, the whole idea of mentorship, of building relationships. And one of the things that occurs to me, I remember when a long time ago, Gordon was doing his doctoral work in Syracuse, and Tom Skurdick commented on his interpretation of why New Brunswick was so successful in moving to inclusion. And I think I'm right, Gordon, in terms of saying that he referred to it with the not very polite term, maybe, of calling it a primitive system. And I think it's interesting that so much of your experience has been in rural areas where like in New Brunswick, you didn't have a lot of specialists. You didn't have a lot of fancy resources. I have the misfortune of living in Toronto, which has had, fantastic special resources and abysmal opportunities for inclusion. And I'm just wondering, Winnipeg is different from the rest of Manitoba. I mean, there are cities of substantial size, but certainly there's the big metropolis and then a lot of rural areas. And I'm just wondering how much you think it's the culture of the rural areas that's really made your approach so successful. And, what's transferable to a city like Winnipeg or to other larger areas?
I would have to say that because I did spend some time working in Winnipeg as well. And I would also add that when I did get to the city and I was working and I was in a consultant coordinator role at that time, so I was working with schools and students, so particular schools and particular students, and I was looking at connecting schools with resources for those students. I was shocked at the number of resources or the increase in resources that were available as compared to my previous experience. So that's kind of an interesting commentary. But I would have to say that in spite of that, overall, I would say that Manitoba is a very, very unique province in all of Canada when I look at education. And I have thought about moving around in my career and moving to another province and looking at education from a perspective of a different province. And I have to tell you, I haven't wanted to. And part of that is because it seems like everyone in Manitoba in education really wants the same thing. They want to see success for students. And I haven't seen a place in the world that is more cooperative than Manitoba. We have our School Boards Association. We have our superintendents, our Manitoba Association of Superintendents. We've got our provincial SAM, which is our Student Services Administrators. We have the parent councils. We have the Manitoba School Business Officials, and we all work together. When I was doing the report for this 1 in 50-year review that we were doing in 2019, I read over some of the submissions from the different organizations, and I was shocked at how similar the conversations were in those submissions. And someone from the Manitoba School Boards Association commented on the things that I had written and said, you just wrote those in such a respectful way. And I think that's the word. It's respect, and it's understanding that that's the way we're going to move forward. And I'm not saying that we don't have challenges here. I mean, we have a Department of Education that has two separate branches. We have the inclusive support branch and we have the curriculum branch. And we have a provincial report card, finally, that is one report card, but it isn't universally designed. And we have a funding model that I think is outdated. It's called the FRAME model, the Financial Reporting for Education in Manitoba, and it drives everything that we do, right? And it's outdated, so we know it doesn't support the work that has to be done in the future. So I'm not saying that Manitoba is the be all and the end all, but I would have to say those values that you talked about initially, Diane, they exist here. And I was having a social media conversation with a former colleague who worked at Manitoba Education, and she said that in and around the time that they were getting traction, because we were largely policy based in Manitoba right up until almost 2000, and we were moving to get legislation in the province, she said there were just the right people who were there at the right time who knew they needed to do the right thing. And so I think that's a really interesting comment in retrospect, coming from someone who was working in the Department of Education at that time. And I think that is really what my experience has been. And when I work in the university now, I'm continuing to make connections. I think when I came to the university, that was my idea, was to continue to make connections with the field, because I think that might be the next step, is connecting the universities in with a great system that's already in place that collaborates well and works well for kids. Yeah.
Leslie, thank you for joining us today. We're about
Oh,
out
you're
of time.
welcome.
I want to give Jackie and Diane just one more quick question with a 30-second answer.
Okay.
Jackie, any
So
final comment
put
or
me on the
question you
spot.
have for Leslie?
I think I would just, maybe I could just add to what Leslie just said and say that I do think that's where we really need to go, right? Is that they talk about the collaboration with leaders and the schools themselves and the community. And I think our faculties of education have to be part of that community so that we do create a much better collaboration.
Okay, Diane?
I guess for me, I just wonder, I'm not very good at keeping up with the literature. But I think that, parents, as Gordon alluded to before, are so often caught in a struggle where the way they articulate what they want and need for their kids, they don't find a receptive audience to it. And the kind of collaboration that you're talking about, parents would love to know how to foster that. What can parents organizations, this whole series is sponsored by Inclusion Canada. What can a movement of families do to help break down what I see in my province, as I said before, is this battle rather than collaboration. And I think you've got some great ideas there. And if you have ideas of how to share them, how to popularize them, that would be fabulous.
Okay, a final word, Leslie?
I'm reading a book by an author by the name of Adam Grant, and he talks about being okay with being wrong and really going into a humility cycle where it's okay to doubt and be curious and discover. And I think we have to be okay with saying, you know what, where we were before, it wasn't okay, it needs to change. And if we're going to move forward, we've got to be all right with that and be humble and move forward with positivity and intent.
Well, Leslie, thank you for chatting with us. We appreciate you taking the time. And I want to remind people that you're one of our, quote, network of associates. And if you go to the Inclusive Education Canada website, you can find our list of associates, more than a couple of dozen of them, and find out more detail about Leslie and her work, and make contact with her if you want to follow up on anything she's talked about today. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
over and out. Thanks so much to everyone.